All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And today we're talking about the fate of Deion Jones and whether if it will parallel that of 49ers pass rusher Dee Ford, as well as answering your leftover listener questions, talking about how many games Marcus Mariota has to win to prove himself as the Falcons franchise quarterback, and what are the odds that Desmond Ridder is the team's long-term starter.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Blue Nile. Make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com, and Locked On listeners get $50 off purchases of $500 or more. This podcast exclusive includes engagement. Use promo code Locked On at checkout. Guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, as well as on YouTube. And you get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. If you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, give us a like, hit that bell so that you notify when we go live. So, guys, today's episode, we got some leftover listener questions. I also want to talk a little bit about Deion Jones because I read a story about Dee Ford and how he's going to get cut once he passes a physical. And I'm like, that parallels a little bit of what I think is going on with Deion Jones, right? So basically, way back in March, we're going to be locked on 49ers for the next couple of seconds. But way back in March, the 49ers basically said, and I think Dee Ford was dealing with whatever injury he was dealing with last year that caused him to miss most of the season. The 49ers basically said he's no longer in our future plans. And essentially this past week, even though he still remains on their roster, they haven't cut him because essentially there are rules like prohibiting teams from cutting injured players. And once he passes their physical, which he's expected to do at some point, again, I don't know the details. Again, check out Locked On 49ers to get more of these details or whatever the case may be. I was skimming the article. But once he passes that physical, probably at, their upcoming mandatory minicamp or whatever the case may be, then they will choose to part ways with him. And again, I think that's very relevant to what's going on with Deion Jones. We know that he recently had sort of a cleanup surgery on his shoulder, and it was announced by the team that he would miss the remainder of the offseason, meaning that he will miss not only the ongoing OTAs, but also the upcoming mandatory minicamp later this month. I think we'll have a similar circumstances that once he is able to clear that physical, and presumably that next one coming up will be at the start of training camp where they give all players sort of a physical coming into camp, then I think the Falcons will move on from him. And obviously, the question has been for several weeks, not if the Falcons will move on, but when the Falcons will move on and how the Falcons will move on. I think it's very likely that they will wind up releasing him. Obviously, we have speculated about possibility of trades. We did a Q&A on Tuesday, and someone asked, sort of what possible, trade being unlikely, but what possible player for player trades. And I mentioned sort of CJ Mosley as one of those. But everybody I talk to is skeptical of a trade. I've been skeptical of a trade because, as I've been told, the Falcons have been quietly shopping him for over a year since last March, and they haven't gotten any takers yet. And I don't think they're going to get any takers at this point in the summer. So I think it's very likely that they will release him at their earliest convenience. I know some people have asked, like, why would they do that? What's the cap reasons? And for me personally, I also kind of wondered, like, what's the cap benefits of doing that? Because essentially you'll be eating a huge amount of dead money this year to add on to the historic amount of dead money that you're already eating this year. And you're only going to get about $1 million in cap savings by releasing him at some point this summer. And it's not as if you're going to get a whole bunch of cap savings next year either, because you would essentially be saving the same amount by releasing him today as you would just keeping him for this upcoming season and releasing him at the end of the season. And so really the only cap benefit that you're getting is saving $1 million this year. Is the only difference between, say, releasing him if you were to release him today and waiting, 9 months to release him or whatever the case may be. So there's really no cap reason, no financial reason why the Falcons are moving on from Deion Jones. It's purely been football reasons, as I have been told and seemingly believe. It's about football, right? We saw Jake Matthews get an extension. We saw Grady Jarrett get an extension. We haven't seen Deion Jones get an extension. We saw a restructure last offseason, actually twice last year, one in the offseason, one right before the season. But I think, you can read into that pretty much everything as it goes. Jake Matthews is seen as a cornerstone piece. The team has praised, him for his leadership and all these various things. They've done the same things with Grady Jarrett, seen as a cornerstone piece. That's why those two guys got extensions. And I think that's why, at least Deion Jones is not seen in that same light. And that's why he is not getting an extension. And you can read into that as you will. I'm not necessarily saying that Deion Jones is a bad guy, a locker room cancer or whatever the case may be. But you've heard me talk about this with, Jarvis Davis of ATL Day Ones on this podcast in the past. I've been talking about this really going back to 2018 on this podcast. It's really about accountability. And to me, leadership in the NFL or leadership in really any walk of life is mostly about accountability. And it's hard for a leader like Deion Jones, presumably, to hold other players accountable if he is also not accountable because, he's not doing his things, right? He's not doing the job that he's supposed to do, right? It's that Dean Pease do your job mantra, and Deion Jones, particularly when it comes to like the run fits and the tackling and all those various things, is not doing his job to a high enough level. And so therefore he can't hold others accountable when he himself is not accountable. And again, it's not to put all the blame on Deion Jones or whatever the case may be. I think a lot of it for him is, this is the kind of the player that he's always been. But I think in the past, when the Falcons were a different team, that player was fine. Right, particularly when the Falcons were a high-powered offense early in Deion Jones's career, and the fact that he was a unreliable run defender wasn't as big an issue then, because the Falcons were able to put a lot of points up on the board, and teams essentially had to abandon the run in order to keep pace with the team. And so therefore his flaws as a run defender rarely showed themselves to be a big issue. Now, they popped up from time to time. I remember going on a very long rant about Deion Jones and Devondre Campbell and their poor ability against the run, way back after that 2017 Bills game where they pounded the ball down our throat. And I was criticizing Deion Jones because he was asked to shadow Tyrod Taylor and did a poor job of that in that game and all these various things. So, Deion Jones has been a controversial figure here on Locked On Falcons, a polarizing figure here on Locked On Falcons, but I certainly think he had his usage, particularly his ability in coverage back in those days when the Falcons had that high-powered offense, and their best run defense was essentially their offense's ability to put points on the board. And then obviously, starting around 2019, things kind of took a turn for the worse for the offense, and they haven't really recovered since then. And I think that's led to some of those issues, the same issues that he's had, going back really to his days at LSU, where he wasn't necessarily a great run defender, showed up then and still show up today. And those things have been exposed more in large part due to the fact that the Falcons, best run defense is no longer their offense. And so we'll just sort of have to see how things go moving forward. I'm not one of these people that sits here and is going to sit here and like, oh, we get rid of Deion Jones and it's like addition by subtraction. And the Falcons have brought in all these linebackers that are going to be great and great fits in the Dean Pease' defense, and it's going to make it work, all because now they have guys that are 6'2" instead of 6'1", and that's going to mean the world of difference. Like, I'm not one of these people that's out here spouting those things. I think, moving forward, we're going to continue to see these same issues at the linebacker position, because I look at a player in particular like Troy Anderson, who has a very similar skill set to Deion Jones, and just because he's like 2 inches taller does that mean he's a better fit in Dean Pease' scheme. But like, I look at Troy Anderson, and if he's going to have success, I think it's going to be in large part tied to the fact not so much that he's this high character player, which by all accounts he is, and may have those leadership skills that you want, but it's going to be tied to the fact that this offense can get back to scoring points. And that's going to help him, put his best foot forward so that his strengths of his game, similar to Deion Jones's coverage, and his weaknesses or run fits, his weaknesses don't get exposed and his strengths get accentuated. And I also think moving forward, the Falcons would help themselves quite a bit by helping Troy Anderson avoid having to be this great run fit downhill linebacker by getting some more beef in the middle of that D line. And so we're hoping that we see the Falcons add that later this summer. Unfortunately, it'll probably be too late to quote unquote save Deion Jones, but maybe it'll be a big step forward for some of these current linebackers that the team is tied to moving forward, including Troy Anderson. So that's my thoughts on that. And we'll continue today's episode answering some of the leftover listener questions that we did not get to on Tuesday's, Twitter Tuesday episode. We got some great questions about sort of who I'm going to time travel back in time to kidnap and put on the Falcons roster. Sort of, are the Saints overrated? We'll talk a little bit about the offensive line improving, the quarterback situation. We'll talk a little bit more about how many games does Marcus Mariota have to win in order to be successful. What are the chances that Desmond Ridder can be the long-term starter here? So we'll get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But before we get there, let me plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast feed, where you get 3 different shows with 4 different perspectives, breaking down not only the local Atlanta sports, but also national sports. That's A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with the aforementioned Jarvis Davis and his lovely co-host Tanisha Batiste. Find them all on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast feed, free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you find Locked On Falcons. And if you check out the Locked On Sports Atlanta feed on YouTube, you will also get access to the Locked On Braves postcast, which breaks down every win, every loss with the insight, the original insight from Locked On Braves. So go check that out on your preferred podcast platform. And guys, I also want to talk to you about Blue Nile. Whether you're looking to pop the question or you're looking for something a little less permanent, why not celebrate your loved ones with a classic, timeless piece of jewelry? If you're looking for that engagement ring, Blue Nile has the online tools that help you sort of build your engagement ring by choosing your shape, size, clarity, style to handcraft that perfect one-of-a-kind engagement ring for your special someone. Or if you're just looking for, a nice tennis bracelet or something like that, you can, find that at BlueNile.com. And if you have a hard time choosing exactly what you're looking for, they have the jewelry experts on hand 24/7 via phone, via chat, to help you pick that memorable gift that's going to fit your budget. So make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com. And Locked On listeners get $50 off purchases of $500 or more. And this podcast exclusive includes engagement. So just use code Locked On. That's code Locked On. Plus, with every order, it's insured, it ships free, and arrives in discreet packaging so that it won't give away what's inside. So shop stress-free and find your forever piece by going to BlueNile.com. So our first question comes from Corey Peacock at Peacock Can Fly. He asks, if you could bring one Falcon from the past and stick him on the roster today, who would it be? And I'm going to choose Julio. Like, I know the analyst in me is going to sit here and be like, oh, we need to beef up the trenches and I need to go out there and time travel and kidnap, Jonathan Babineau or Grady Jackson or somebody like that, or Andy Levitri or Alex Mack or somebody like that. No, look, the fan of me is just basically like, if I'm going to be subjected to watching the Falcons each and every Sunday, give me somebody that is going to be fun to watch. Give me somebody that's entertaining. And there's no better person out there than Julio. Maybe Michael Vick, maybe Deion Sanders are up in that boat, but I'll take Julio every single day of the week. Our next question comes from Carson Smith at Big Dog 44. Does the offensive line make a jump from where they were last year, or am I crazy for hoping that is the case? Keep up the good work on the pod. Thank you, Carson. And yes, you are absolutely crazy, but we're all crazy because we all made the terrible decision in our youths. I know myself over 30 years ago when I was 8 years old to become Falcon fans, and the fact that we're still sticking with this team for this long makes us all crazy. So you're in good company, Carson, with that regard. But in all seriousness, I do expect, improvement. But I'm not expecting this massive jump, right? Pro Football Focus ranked the Falcons offensive line at the end of last season 27th in the NFL. I'm hoping that they can maybe improve like 5 to 7 spots, getting that 20, 22, 23 range, somewhere around there. and that will be a big enough jump for me. That's good progress in my book. That's competence, right? The Bengals were 20th in Pro Football Focus's rankings at the end of last season, and we know that they still had a bad offensive line, but it wasn't so bad that it sort of prevented their offense from functioning like the Falcons' offensive line was. Clearly, the Bengals were able to still win despite having a bad offensive line. And so, in the Bengals case, a lot of the other areas of the roster was clicking: the defense, the passing game, all those various things. And so, like, that's kind of the hope for it. Getting that 20-ish range. And at least if the other areas of the Falcons roster are working, the offensive line isn't so terrible that it's going to prevent those areas from shining. Thick and Cheese asks, bro, why do Aints fans think they better? They got Winston. Like, really? Well, I think it's less about Jameis Winston. It's more about the supporting cast they have built around him. It's the same supporting cast that they built around, or essentially the same supporting cast that they built around Drew Brees' corpse those last couple of years. So it ultimately really doesn't matter who the quarterback is, because and Falcon fans know this well. Again, I don't mean to take shots at the Falcons, but like, we're 0-3 against Taysom Hill as a starter. And I think because the main reason is because they run the football against, I think I looked it up the other day and I don't remember the exact number, but I think in those 3 starts against Taysom Hill, the Saints have run for a combined 560 yards against the Falcons. Right. And that's just, I use that to illustrate the point that their offense is predicated on running the football. And they're able to successfully do that is because they have such a good defense. They've consistently finished in the top 5 to 10 these last several years, and they should have continuity there at that position with Dennis Allen, the defensive coordinator, who's sort of headed those defenses, taking over as a head coach. Obviously, the loss of Sean Payton should be significant when it comes to the offense, and they have question marks in terms of their play calling. Their offensive line probably won't be as strong as it has been in previous years. The only real hole on the defensive side of the ball, I think, is maybe the safety position, not because they don't have very talented safeties in Marcus May and Honey Badger, but just because they traditionally like to play a lot more cover 2. They like to play a little bit more man coverage, and they want to have that sort of single high safety. And Marcus Williams was sort of perfect in that role. And then Malcolm Jenkins could be the other sort of safety these last couple of years and be a little bit more of that versatile guy. And when you look at guys like May and Matthew, both of those guys kind of fit more of that versatile role. But I imagine May will probably be the deep safety, and Honey Badger will be the guy playing a little bit more closer to the line of scrimmage and doing all the various things that we've seen Honey Badger do. So I think the reason why Saints think they're better is because, frankly, they are better, at least in terms of the supporting cast that they have built around their quarterback, that they can sort of take the pressure off of Jameis Winston by being a run-first offense and playing a high-level defense, even if, their quarterback play is not elite. And to Jameis Winston's credit, he did play well for the 7 games that he was healthy for last year. He's very efficient in large part, even without having, great wide receivers. And not to mention, they're getting Michael Thomas back. They're getting Jarvis Landry. They're getting Chris Olave. So I think those are compelling reasons why the Saints fans think they're better. And I know some of you are already mad at me because I've said more positive things about the Saints than I have said about the Falcons, in the last, 60 seconds than I've said in the last 60 years with the Falcons. But, in my defense, I try to live in reality, guys. And if I see a team that's 3rd in DVOA and I see a team that's 30th in DVOA, my fandom is not going to sit here and be like, well, we're better than that team. You know what I'm saying? So again, you think it makes me feel good to be sitting here admitting that the Saints are better than the Falcons? Oh, that's part of my frustration with this team. It's like, come on, man. Can we close this gap here with the Saints? But and I know, people were like, hey, we beat the Saints last year. And yeah, because we stopped the run in that one particular game. That was one of the 2 games where the Falcons run defense was good last year. And we also got the benefit of facing Trevor Siemian in that game as well. So, as long as we don't face, I don't know. I don't know who their 3rd string quarterback, Ian Book or whatever the case may be. I think he's probably the one guy that will be, because, we struggle against Jameis Winston and Taysom Hill. So hopefully we'll be able to, take care of business this year against the Saints again. But I'm not going to hold my breath on that regard. And to make it clear, I don't think the Saints are going to be great. I think they maybe could challenge for a wild card spot or whatever the case may be, but I do think they'll probably be better than the Falcons. But on that note, we'll leave that aside and, talk a little bit more about the Falcons quarterback situation as we continue today's episode and answer the rest of your listener questions. But before we get there, guys, I want to ask you for a favor to head on over to lockedonpodcast.com/survey. and help us out by taking a survey. Tell us how you think the Locked On shows can be even better. Maybe you tell us what you like, what you don't like, how much you hate me talking up the Saints on this podcast. I'm sure there's a survey question for that. And, once you fill that out, it's not going to take too much time. You also get a chance to win one of 10 $100 Ticketmaster gift cards. So go ahead on over to lockedonpodcast.com/survey. Thank you in advance. And guys, I want to tell you about Built Bar, the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. It's even better than a candy bar because, like candy bars, Built Bars are covered with 100% real chocolate, but they not only taste good, they're good for you. They're low in sugar, low in calories, low in carbs, high in protein, high in fiber. They have a variety of flavors: brownie, batter, puff, birthday cake. You got the caramel brownie flavor that they're unveiling recently. If you're a big fan of, brownies, you don't have to worry about, eating that unhealthy dessert late at night because, caramel brownies, healthy, low in calories, high in protein, all those various things. So head on over to built.com, find your preferred flavor, whether that's caramel brownie or something else, and use the promo code LOCKED15 and you get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15, LOCKED15, for 15% off at built.com. So our next question comes from Rob P at Happa Rob on Twitter. He says, Aaron, your work is great. Thanks, Rob. Since most of Atlanta media is already anointing Ridder the job, how many wins for Mariota to be the franchise quarterback? So I won't pretend to speak for everyone, but, I don't think it's, or at least most of the people I talk to, I can't speak for everyone. I don't think it's really about anointing Ridder the job. It's just, whether Ridder is, the team's long-term quarterback is a much more compelling conversation because I just think everybody knows the odds of Mariota being the long-term answer here is very, very low. And the chances that he's even back with the Falcons in 2023 is very, very low. They essentially signed him to a 1-year contract. It's technically a 2-year deal, but it's really a 1-year rental. And then they drafted a quarterback in the 3rd round and may wind up being in a position to draft a quarterback high next year. And so basically Mariota is just a bridge quarterback, and, bridges are fun, but like they're not that fun. You know what I'm saying? So I think to answer your question though, Rob, in order for Mariota to be the quote unquote franchise quarterback for the Falcons to be like, oh, we'll bring him back on that 2nd-year salary. I can't remember off the top of my head. I want to say it's like a $14 million or $18 million cap hit next year or whatever the case may be, which I think will put him in the top 15 highest paid quarterbacks in the league. He's going to have to start the season strong. I've set the over under for Marcus Mariota in terms of starts this year at 7. Like, I think he'll get to 7. I don't know if he's going to go over that number, and we'll just sort of have to see. And a lot of that is dependent on how he performs in those first 7 games and how this team performs in those first 7 games. But basically, from my perspective, he'll be the franchise quarterback in the sense of like, oh, not only will the Falcons bring him back next year, but they'll plan on bringing him back for a couple of other years and maybe even consider, giving him an extension is if he can bring the team to the postseason. And I think in order for you to feel good about the Falcons, potentially being a playoff team in those first 7 games, they're going to have to probably win like 4 of them, which, I know at face value doesn't seem like a huge hurdle to climb. But when you look at some of those teams that they're facing, I think that's going to be a tall ask for Mariota. So if they get off to a 4-3 start, like that to me is a team that should be in playoff contention by the time we get to the end of the year. And if they are able to maintain that, then I think Marcus Mariota will have a chance to be the quote unquote franchise quarterback. But let's move on to Greg W's at ATL Greg 88 question. What is the likelihood Ridder starts the season, and what is the likelihood he is the long-term starter at this stage? So I sort of, ballpark the figure in terms of his chances of being the week 1 starter at like say 30%. It's harder for me to go higher than that. I don't think it should be higher than that. I think, as I've said many times in the podcast, I think you want to throw Mariota to the Wolves, give your chance the best chance of potentially getting off to that good start against these quality opponents with a veteran quarterback. So I'm not one of these folks that's rushing to get Ridder out on the field as soon as possible. I think, sitting for 6 or 7 weeks or more is actually only going to help him and allow him to put his best foot forward. In terms of the chances that he's the long-term starter, if you mean like he's still the starting quarterback for this team 5 years from now, it's harder for me to go above like 15%. I just don't think the odds are necessarily in his favor. I don't think his hit rate I've talked about this a ton already over the last week or two, that the hit rate on quarterbacks taken around where he's taken is about 15%. And I don't think the situation that Ridder is going into is going to enhance those odds to any significant degree. To me, the real question with Ridder is going to be if he does wind up playing this year, and I do think it's very likely that he will get some starts. It's just again, it's a question of how many he gets. And a lot of that's depending on, how Mariota does and all these various other factors that are unknowns at this point in time. But I think the question with Ridder is going to be, is he going to be the starter for the team week 1 of 2023? And right now, I feel like that's kind of a coin flip at this point in time. Obviously, a lot depends on sort of where the Falcons finish, if they take a quarterback or whatever the case may be. So again, a lot of unknowns with that regard, but I think it's about 50-50 that he could be the starter next year. But in terms of, still being the starter, 3+ years down the road from that, I think it's pretty low. Lenny 184, I've heard you say a couple of times lately that you consider Cordarrelle Patterson as possibly the greatest return man of all time. So would you take him over prime Hester? I basically said Patterson is arguably the best kickoff returner of all time because, the production speaks for itself, while I would say Devin Hester is arguably, and I would love to see someone argue against it. Maybe you could have made the argument a couple of years ago that Deion Jones was the answer, but or not Deion Jones, Deion Sanders. But Hester's arguably the greatest punt returner of all time. And given that league rules are kind of make it so that punting still kind of matters and kickoffs don't currently, I would probably lean Hester in that regard. But obviously, if you went back 20 years ago when kickoffs still mattered, you probably might lean Patterson in that situation. Our last question comes from Jordan Aldridge at JDA Jordan. He asks, I have been starting up podcasting, and I would love to hear some of your suggestions, such as what do you use to record your audio, or how do you set up for a podcast in general? That has been my problem figuring out the right setup. So what I'm holding right now is a USB microphone. It's called an ATR 2100. I believe it's currently priced at like $80 on Amazon. I think I got it several years ago. I think it was like $70 at that point in time. As far as audio and video editing software, I use the free software that came on my Macintosh, which is GarageBand and iMovie. You don't need to go beyond that. I mean, if you want to, you can spend money on more extensive stuff, but basically they work fine. I watched like a couple of 10-minute YouTube tutorials on how to use them, and that worked for me. As far as the rest of your setup, in terms of like what you do when you get in front of the camera or get in front of a microphone, do whatever's you're comfortable with. Generally, like I go through, and as you can tell, like when you see my eyes moving off screen, like I have a document open that sort of has like bullet points and notes that I want to get to on each episode, because you guys hear me say and a lot, and I'm doing it as I speak. It's impossible for me to not do it. But like if I didn't do that, that would be like 90% of the audio on the show. It's already 50% of the audio show, but having these sort of notes and like a Google Doc open and a text file open helps me sort of organize my notes so that I don't get lost in the train of thought and all the various tangents I go to. So I would recommend that if you're able to do that. I think generally the technical aspects of podcasting aren't as hard as you may think. Again, you can just basically spend less than an hour on YouTube and you can pick that up. For me, I know we talked about me getting a new mic phone or a mic stand or mic holder or whatever the case may be. The reason I haven't gotten one, guys, is because it's in the mail. I'm going to be changing up my setup in the next week or so, maybe even next couple of days. And so like I'm, waiting for some of the stuff to come in the mail. But I know for me, when I initially had the idea, like the first time I wanted to do a Falcons podcast was back in 2007. But because, I didn't really think I would be good on the mic or whatever the case may be, I never got around to doing it because I was just hoping like, I'll produce a podcast and have other people that are actually good at talking to do that podcast, and I'll like produce it or whatever the case may be. but like I was basically waiting around for like two random people to come along and say, hey, Aaron, you want to do a podcast? And eventually, after several years, eventually in 2011, I realized like if you want something done, you got to do it yourself. And so I started up the podcast. The original co-host was Ryan Valdez. Without him, we wouldn't have this podcast. It wouldn't exist. So shout out to Ryan. But we had sort of falling out within like a year, and sort of had two different competing sort of perspectives on the direction of the podcast. Like I wanted it to be like football focused, and he wanted to do sort of like this more all encompassing sports entertainment podcast. And so he like wanted to talk about like the Kardashians and wrestling and all these various other topics that I don't care about. And so I bring that up mostly because like I think, you know, when you do your own podcast, or anybody out there, my recommendation, the advice I give you is not about the technical stuff. It's about the passion, right? If you find your lane, find the thing that you're passionate about, and you know that will keep you motivated and keep you doing the thing that you want to do. I did this podcast for over 5 years before I made a dime, and probably 99% of the people that do podcasts will probably never make a dime off of this. I was fortunate enough to do a podcast on a thing that's relatively popular, and unfortunately, you know, the Locked On Network sort of came into being and was looking, you know, for Falcons podcasts, and there weren't a ton of them, you know. We're almost 6 years ago that existed, so we came up on the radar. And certainly, you know, the years and work that we put in, it was the sort of right opportunity for us to come along and do this. And now I actually, you know, make a decent amount of money doing this podcast. But you know, my recommendation is find something that you're really passionate about, so that when you're doing your podcast, whether it's a daily one, whether it's a weekly one, whether it's a monthly one, you know, it's going to be something that you're going to be motivated to do, right? You know, it's hard to build an audience. And so like you're probably not going to get the results. Again, I don't know what you're going to do, whether it's a football podcast, whether it's a bird watching podcast, whatever it is. You know, everybody has a podcast now. Like the market is flooded. And so like if you want to do it because you love talking about this thing, do it because you love, you know, you're interested in the subject, not doing it because, you know, it's some sort of harebrained get rich quick scheme, because there's not a whole lot of money in podcasting. It's just basically advertising and, you know, Built Bar and Blue Nile or whatever the case may be. But, you know, they're not necessarily knocking on, you know, beginners doors and whatnot, is the case. So that's my recommendation for you, Jordan. I hope that helps anybody else out there that's interested and that listens to this podcast. You know, I know some of you guys in the YouTube comments know and insist that you could do a better podcast than what I do. So, you know, there's my recommendation. So that's sort of your starting point, so that you can come in and blow the doors off of me and start your own podcast. Or, you know, a couple of years down the road, I can sit here and laugh at you and say, ha, you thought it was so easy, huh? You thought you could be better than me, huh? You know, I'm not petty at all. So that's going to do it for us, guys. We'll leave it there. You know, shout out to Alan Stirk as well. Wouldn't be here without him, as well as Dave Choate. You know, that was a big reason why we were able to get on Locked On's radar, because of the success we had. So I want to give them their kudos as well. Wouldn't be here without any of those guys. So there you guys have it. We'll be back tomorrow with the D'Angelo Malone scouting report. We're not talking about the R&B singer, but you know, D'Angelo Malone scouting report. We'll be breaking him down on tomorrow's episode. So guys, I really appreciate it. I appreciate all the great questions that you guys sent in. Thought this was going to be a short one, but we're still over 30 minutes as usual. You know, I tend to be very loquacious, but appreciate you guys for submitting your questions. Appreciate you guys for tuning in for another episode of Locked On Falcons. Thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, check out Locked On NFL for your second listens of the day, where you can get the lowdown on all 32 NFL teams and all the big news around the NFL. Appreciate it, guys. Till then.